Section 2 of your reading this week discusses the functions of American government. While there's a great deal of debate about the specific things government should or should not be doing, the basic functions of the national government were spelled out in the Constitution drafted in 1787, and they still structure how we think about the role of government today. As you are reading about the functions of American government in your chapter, I hope some of the words were familiar to you. Basically, each function of the national government is listed in the preamble of the United States Constitution. The preamble is a sort of executive summary of why the framers created a new government through the Constitution. The preamble reads, "We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America." This very tidy sentence provides the basis for virtually everything the government does today. Let's spend a little time considering each of these functions. The first purpose of the government formed by the Constitution, mentioned in the preamble, was to form a more perfect union. Now, this is a bit different than the other functions of American government. We don't, for instance, have a governmental agency specifically dedicated to strengthening the bonds of union amongst the 50 states. So we're going to put this particular issue aside for just a while until the next module, when we'll discuss the Constitution in further detail. For now, I just want to highlight the fact that this was a major concern of the framers of the Constitution: how to create a unified nation out of a somewhat ragtag collection of colonies that each had their own distinct political history and customs, religious and ethnic backgrounds, and economic interests. Please review the section of Chapter 1 labeled "The First Colonists" to get a sense of how some of the colonies developed along these very different lines. The image on this slide is an early American political cartoon by Benjamin Franklin, not so subtly making the case for the importance of union. The drafters of the Constitution were interested in creating a government that would establish justice. This is a major function of any government and was not a new idea at the time of American independence. Governments throughout history have taken it upon themselves to foster societies that abide by a set of principles. Sometimes these principles have been based in religious texts. Sometimes they've been based upon decrees by the ruler or rulers. For early Americans, their conception of justice was largely based upon their cultural and historical ties to Europe. For a period of centuries, European nations had been moving fitfully from governments based on the rule of man to governments based on the rule of law. The rule of man is a term for a system in which the ruler governs arbitrarily. In other words, the law is whatever the ruler says it is. In these systems, the ruler is above the law. Now, by the time the American colonies broke away from King George, Britain had already done quite a lot to limit the powers of the monarch. But to the Americans, they felt harshly treated by a system that did not sufficiently respect the rule of law. A major function of the government they established through the Constitution was to create a legal system that provides greater protections to the people for fair treatment and would limit abuses of power. Another major function of government is to provide order in society. The constitutional framers elegantly phrased this as ensuring domestic tranquility. Some political philosophers consider this to be the primary purpose of any government. They argue that without government, societies would fall into a state of anarchy, where people would be in constant physical danger, and their property would be under continual threat. So governments are given great powers. They're the only institution in society given the legitimate use of force. According to these philosophers, it is the implied threat of force by the government against those who break the law that keeps society in a relative state of order. The framers of the Constitution were particularly concerned about this issue because many of them perceived a state of lawlessness in the newly independent states shortly after the end of the Revolutionary War. Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts, which we will return to in the next module, was a major flashpoint for creating the U.S. Constitution. giving some justification to those who saw the states as being too weak to establish order, highlighting the need for a stronger national government. Just as governments function to provide order within the territory they govern, they also exist to protect their people from external dangers. From the earliest days of the Republic, when the United States was a small player on the international stage, concerned about threats from imperial powers such as Britain and France, to contemporary times in which the United States fields the most powerful military force in world history, national defense has always been a core function of American government. Promoting the general welfare is a highly aspirational function of government. Unlike some of the other functions, which are oriented around preventing something negative, such as disorder or foreign aggression, promoting the common welfare involves government action for the betterment of society. While our society places a great deal of emphasis on individual responsibility and individual achievement, it's also true that there are many important things we cannot do alone as individuals. We are social beings who form groups so we can act collectively to achieve things in common. Government is one arena in which we come together to take collective action. Whether it's schools or libraries, highways or national park trails, government is an important institution for providing services and amenities for the common good. The artwork pictured in this slide was produced during the Depression to promote New Deal programs, which represented a substantial increase in the federal government's involvement in programs to promote the general welfare. That trend has continued, along with a great deal of controversy to this day, where most of the new tasks that government has taken on in recent decades falls under this category of promoting the general welfare. The last function of government listed in the preamble of the Constitution is to secure the blessings of liberty. We Americans have been brought up to celebrate our liberties, but we often don't think very deeply about this deceptively complex concept. Let's think about this for a minute. What is liberty exactly? Is it the freedom to do whatever you want, whenever you want? That's certainly not what the framers of the Constitution had in mind. They would have considered that definition of liberty to be a recipe for anarchy. So, if it's not absolute freedom of action, then what exactly is liberty? I ask you to pause this lecture and take a few minutes to write down in your own words what liberty means to you. Then on the next slide, I will offer some brief thoughts about what the framers of the Constitution meant by this term. So, what did you come up with for your understanding of liberty? I hope you'll post your thoughts about this in the discussion forum. Let me now just offer a few thoughts about how those who created American government thought about liberty. They certainly thought liberty was something other than total freedom of individual action. They viewed governmental restrictions on people's behavior as an important element of maintaining a just and orderly society. They also considered government to have a role in maintaining community standards and upholding moral values. Now, things obviously start getting messy when you ask the question of whose standards and whose morals government should uphold. To the framers, liberty was largely about having broad freedoms to participate in that process of determining what standards and morals government should enforce. In addition to that, they had a marketplace-based idea of liberty, that for the most part, people should be free to interact with one another and pursue their interests as they see fit, so long as they're not violating basic standards. So to the founders, liberty meant something like the freedom to act within the scope of community standards that have been determined through an open and participatory process. Let's finish up our discussion of liberty by applying the ideas we've discussed to a current example, drug laws. Now, there's nothing specifically about the regulation of drug use in the Constitution, and laws that prevent the distribution and use of certain drugs certainly constitute a restriction on individuals' freedom of action. But the framers probably would not have viewed this as a violation of liberty. So long as the drug laws are based on community standards for promoting the common good and are enacted through an open, participatory process, they are justified. So if we consider heroin, for example, most folks would agree that preventing people from using this drug is a legitimate use of government power for the common good. Widespread heroin use is not only a danger to the drug users themselves, but it also creates disorder in society as it destroys families and promotes associated crimes. Now, what about marijuana? This is a good example of how our liberty is defined in concrete terms through debate about what our community standards should be. For a very long time, most people placed marijuana in the same category as heroin, as a dangerous drug that should obviously be restricted by government. But recently, through the open, participatory process of politics, we've seen challenges to those old standards. Now, many people argue that marijuana is not particularly dangerous to the users themselves, and may in fact be medically beneficial in certain circumstances. They also contend that marijuana poses little threat to the broader community. Those who hold this view therefore argue that marijuana laws are an unjust restriction of individual liberty. As a political scientist, I find this to be a fascinating example because the changes in both public opinion and the laws regarding marijuana use have occurred so rapidly.